Hey, what is going on, everybody? Hope you're doing well today. Man, it's a beautiful day, and I can't believe that it's just now the beginning of March. So spring and summer are upon us. There's nothing we can do about it, right? So today we're going to be doing the third installment of Before the First Shot. And what we're going to be talking about today is just as important as selecting that right bow for you. We're going to be talking about arrows. Now, I've shot a lot of different arrows over the course of my time out here shooting, and I'm not going to tell you my personal preferences because, again, I don't think that's going to help you any. But what we are going to talk about is how to select the right arrow for your setup and find something that fits and works for you. So we're going to be shooting my longbow today. We're just going to be taking some shots, talking about arrows, and we're just going to enjoy this beautiful day. So without further ado, let's dive into this episode and let's have some fun. All right, so let's talk selecting arrows. Now, when you're first starting out, the process can seem a little bit daunting. You may not know which arrows to get, and that's understandable. I was the same way when I first started out. And actually, I was using some cut down carbon shafts from a friend of mine that gave me the arrows that he was getting rid of. These were really dangerous arrows. They were sketchy, if you will, because they were too short for what I was doing, and I really put myself in an unsafe situation. So we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But my two rules for picking your arrows: one, know the draw weight of your bow. Two, know your draw length. Your draw length is important. That kind of fits into the sketchy arrow thing I was just talking about. But really, it's an overwhelming process when you first start out because you just don't know which to get. Now, for me, if you look at the spine chart like this one here, this gives you a lot of useful information. First, it gives you what type of bow you're shooting: compound or traditional recurve or longbow. Next, it gives you draw weight. It's going to give you the length of the arrows that you're shooting. It's going to, factor in what tip you're going to be using, if it's a 125, a 100, 150, and it's going to give you a recommended spine based on all of those factors that go into selecting that arrow. Now, one thing I want you to know, this is not a hard and fast rule. You can kind of throw the chart out the window and do whatever you want to do, but it does get you in a really good place to start with whenever you're first starting out. So the beautiful thing about arrow selection is that you can really go in a lot of different directions with this. You don't have to do what everybody says, but you do want to make sure that you get the proper spine for your bow, just to make sure that the arrows you're shooting are safe, because you have two different variables when it comes to your spine. You have what's called a static spine, which is the spine recommendation for the arrow as it sits, not being shot, which is 300, 350, 400, 500, 600, so on and so on. Then you have what's called a dynamic spine. Your dynamic spine is how much that arrow shaft flexes when you release it from the arrow. So picking the right static spine is going to help you when it comes to your dynamic spine or tuning your arrows. Now, a lot of this, if you think about it, if you go back some, before bows had center cut shelves or almost center cut shelves, really you had something called the archer's paradox that you had to work with. And the archer's paradox was how much that arrow actually flexed as it was released to get around the bow grip or just the bow itself. But again, with a center cut shelf, you don't really have to worry about that too much. And I'll probably take a little heat for that, but that's okay. But you do want to have a right spine, and if you're tuning, that's going to affect the dynamic spine. That in turn is going to affect how the arrow flies as it goes towards the target to make an impact. Okay, so now you've determined which spine you need for your bow. And the next thing you're going to have to deal with, and it's really, I don't think it's relevant to choosing your arrows right now, especially if you're not into tuning, but it's something fascinating I wanted to share with you. Now, this is in layman terms, so don't blast me too much in the comments. I am just an old country boy that likes to get out and shoot. So. Okay, so you've got your spine of your arrow picked out. It's rated for your bow, and you're going to feel confident and safe in shooting this arrow. So whenever you release that shot, what's going to happen is one of two things. It's either going to fly straight as a dart and just hit that target right where you want it, or you're going to have a left or a right impact. Now, if you have a left or a right impact, what I'm talking about is how stiff or how weak that arrow is. Now, a lot of things are going to affect this dynamic spine part of your arrow. One, the overall length of the arrow. The longer the arrow, the more flex. The next thing is going to be what components you're actually using with your arrow. In my arrows, I use either a 20 or a 50 grain weighted insert in the front end of the arrows, and then I use 125 grain fill tip up front. So whenever you pull that bow back and you've got that energy stored in those limbs, as soon as you release that string, what's happening is all of that stored energy in the limbs goes right here. This is a mission critical part, if you will, because all of that energy is here and it starts to push that arrow forward. Now, depending on what you have up front, that's actually creating a stop or a push back against the energy in the nock area, pushing the arrow forward, and then the weight up front actually causes it to flex the arrow. That's where that archer's paradox is coming in, because whenever you would release that shot, how much flex is actually going to be in that arrow to help it get around that riser. Now, that is what is called the dynamic spine of the arrow. Now, if you get into tuning and you really get serious about it, what you're going to notice is if you're shooting and you see a nock right, meaning it impacts the target, it impacts the target where the nock is this way, that means your arrow is too stiff. And whenever you're releasing it, all it's doing is doing this right off the arrow, off the rest or the body of the bow or the grip area of the bow. And then if you're getting a nock right, a nock left, excuse me, like this, that's indicating the arrow is too weak, because what it's doing is actually flexing around that shaft and it doesn't correct itself before it gets to the target. Now, you can affect that in a great way just by either cutting down the shafts or how much weight you're putting up front. And you can also affect it by having weighted in the back too, because again, that energy released is pushing against that arrow and everything that's up front of that arrow and causing that flex or that dynamic spine. All right, one last point or tip about arrows is the overall arrow length. And you want to look at what your draw length is. Now, I mentioned something about sketchy arrows at the beginning of this video. And what I meant by that was those arrows were cut way too short for my draw length, and I was really putting myself in an unsafe situation. And how I was doing that was this. Whenever I would draw the arrow back, what happened was I was getting almost like here, mid-shelf of the bow, and then releasing that shot. Now, luckily, I didn't do anything dumb enough to hurt myself, but I could have. So you want to be careful of that, because you want to get your arrows long enough based on your draw length for when and if you decide to tune those arrows. Because one of the processes in tuning an arrow is actually cutting down the shafts, and you do that in 1/8 inch or 1/4 inch increments till you get it to fly as straight as you possibly can. And we'll cover tuning in another video. But if you get that arrow too short, that can put you in an unsafe situation. Let's say that your finger's in the way there and you don't realize it, and you're releasing that shot, that could go through your finger. Or worse yet, you could get back past the riser just a bit and then shoot yourself in the hand. I preferably like 32 to 33 inch arrow shafts. That way it gives me a little bit of room to tune for my 30 inch draw length. And even if I don't tune the arrows, they're still long enough where I feel safe and confident to shoot them without worrying about shooting myself in the hand. So make sure you're looking for that. Don't just take somebody's cut down arrow shafts. Don't just grab the first ones you see. Really think about that. Really think about all the factors that go into picking that arrow for your setup. Make sure that you get the right spine for your bow, just a static setup, if you will. Because if you got too much draw weight, let's say you're shooting a 60-pound draw weight bow, and you draw that arrow back and you're ready to release it. Well, let's say you're shooting 600 or 700 spined arrow. There's going to be an awful lot of flex coming from the force those limbs, or from the energy stored in those limbs, and it's really going to tax that arrow when you release it, especially if you have weight up front or a lot of weight up front. And what could happen is you could actually destroy that arrow, and the arrow fragments could go into your hand. So there's my video on selecting your first arrows, especially if you're just getting started. There are so many variables when it comes to arrows. I've just covered a kind of a high-level overview. You really, again, just want to make sure that the static spine is matched to your bow or as close as possible. That's not a hard and fast rule. I know I've shot a lot of different spines from all of my bows and shot them well. But you really want to make sure you get the right length, right spine right out of the gate, especially if you're not tuning. You just want to make sure that your components are good, and really, really, really do this before you get out to shoot every time. Check your arrows. Just a quick little flex will reveal cracks and damages to the arrow. Really inspect your arrows. If you're target practicing a lot and you miss a lot, like I do occasionally, a lot, you want to make sure that everything is still in good order, especially up front here, because you might not see it after one or two impacts, but enough impacts on the front end of the arrow here can actually cause this insert to push back into the arrow shaft itself, and that could create splintering and splits. And then when you see stuff like that, trash the arrow. Don't try to save it. It's not worth it. It's not worth the arrow exploding when you release it and going through your hand. Also, make sure your nocks are in top-notch order. If these are not, what's going to happen is, and I've had this happen to me before, you're going to release that arrow and one of these ears is going to break off, and it's going to just throw that arrow whichever way it wants to go, and it's going to create a dry fire situation. Your nocks are really one of the most important parts of your bow, of your arrow rather, because they take the entirety of the stored energy from those limbs that's being transferred to this one point right here on the string, and that is where your nock is. So if you think about it, if I can get to snap on there, that nock is taking a lot of pressure and doing a lot of work for this arrow to get downrange. So make sure you inspect your arrows every time you go out to shoot. If not every time, at least every other time, because again, I prefer you be safe out there. So I hope you're enjoying this series. I hope it's really giving you some insight, especially if you're a new archer. And I'm always open to comments and questions, so please post them below. I love your comments, and I try to get back to them as fast as possible. As we go through this series and we keep going further in, I think next time we're going to talk about bowstrings, because I get questions a lot about which bowstring, Fast Flight, Dacron, Flemish twist or endless loop strings. What's your favorite? Which one do you like the best? So we're going to be talking about strings in the next video, and then we're going to go into a string building tutorial. Sorry, my brain got ahead of my mouth there. But again, I hope you're enjoying this series. I hope it's helping you, especially if you're a new archer and you got a lot of questions. Thank you all so much for coming by and hanging out with me. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate that you take the time to invest in my content, and it means the world to me. Thanks again, everybody. I hope you have a great day, a better day tomorrow, and a wonderful week ahead of you. And until next time.